Good afternoon, Greg. How are you?
I'm doing great, Kurt, other than a minor thunderstorm passing by, but things are good here.
All right. Well, glad you are safe. I heard there was a little bit of hail. I understand that you're a little bit south of the Annapolis area, just outside of Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So for anybody who might not know me, my name is Kurt Greening. I work for a company called Securis, and we are in the business of helping government agencies, government contractors, also regulated industries like banks and healthcare, remove data from end-of-life electronics and then recycle them in an environmental responsible way. So I'm glad that I have Greg Witte here joining me. He works for a company called Palydin, and Greg supports a bunch of federal clients, but also has some commercial clients. Most people who have listened to us in the past would know about the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. In the past, I've talked about standards like NIST 800-88. Greg has also worked with DHS, a program called Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation, or CDM. And he's actually been in information security for more than 30 years, been a part of tons of cool projects. He's built some models and frameworks. We may talk a little bit more later about his work with a security organization known as ISACA. But I will, at the end of the show, maybe let people know how they can reach out to you, Greg, because yourself and your company, you help people, at least my understanding, is better integrate cybersecurity risk considerations into enterprise risk management activities, which for me, I understand that, the opportunities or the threats are growing. And so it's super important to have people like you keeping our way of life safe and protecting us from cyber adversaries. So Greg, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah, ready to help anytime.
Awesome. So you and I, Greg, we originally met out in Las Vegas at a conference known as ACE, which is the yearly conference from the International Association of IT Asset Managers. And I understand that you're pretty active in that organization. I think you may even teach some classes besides volunteering at their conference. Tell me what interests you about that organization.
Oh, thanks. Yes, usually what happens in Vegas stays there, but we met in Henderson, so it's a little bit outside the Strip.
We can talk about it then.
Yes, exactly. Now, I've been really fortunate to work with ITAM for going on a decade now. If you look at security controls, if you download any of the controls frameworks, you'll see that they always start with asset management. And that's for good reason. We all know you can't secure or even really manage your asset, the resources that companies depend on so heavily, unless you know what you have and where it is and what it's being used for. So for that reason, IT asset management really is the hub for, at least from an IT and OT perspective, for the whole organization. So good security begins with good asset management. So I got to know Dr. Barb and the team at ITAM long ago. And yes, as we've talked more and more about security, and as I got to know their certification programs, particularly their CAMC program that focuses on asset management security, it really helps us to understand exactly where that asset management piece fits. And they also do a really good job of thinking about the total cost of ownership, better than most organizations I've seen. If you think about, for example, think about what you were saying, Kurt, about Securis. We know even when we first purchase a laptop that there's going to come a day when I'm going to need your team to help me to basically decommission that device and maybe even do some work to make sure that you've dispositioned the drives correctly. We know there's going to be a cost, so we should be thinking about that cost even when we first requisition it, or when we have our moves and adds and changes. So we should be thinking about that in advance, and you should be thinking about the patching and the updates and the licenses and the training. There's a total cost to that, and ITAM does a good job of helping us to think about that. to make sure that, both from a good business standpoint and from a risk management standpoint, we need to be thinking about really the total life cycle of that ownership, including, of course, good disposition. So that was how we got involved, and it's really exciting to be kind of looking at where those circles of the security and IT asset management really overlap quite heavily.
Yeah. So International Association of IT Asset Managers, I think, a wonderful organization. Anybody that gets involved in asset management, I would recommend that they join. I'll try to post a link in the show notes. But Greg, I talked about you being a cyber guy and being in cybersecurity for 30 years. We talked about IT asset management being one component of cybersecurity, but tell me, how did you get into cybersecurity?
Yeah, it's true. The gray beard is real. Yeah, I started out even just straight out of high school working in factories building computer equipment and networking equipment. I'd always played with networks and amateur radio as a kid. So for a while I was working in factories building networking equipment, and one of my customers in the federal government, they had one of the early inter-networking routers. They called us up and said, "Hey, your router's broken." So we went out with our toolkit, and I went out there with my packet sniffer and said, "My router's fine. Your network's broken." "No, my network's fine. Your router's broken." Went back and forth a little bit. And it turned out to be one of the very early federal security bugs on the brand new, shiny new thing called the internet. I think they were in the process of moving from ARPANET to internet. But at the time, the networking company that I was supporting was starting to go out of business. This little upstart company called Cisco was starting to come out. Yeah. And they were, obviously, Ethernet was growing, and this security thing seemed kind of interesting. So I said, maybe I'll try that for a while. Of course, that was 1993, and we're still going. But it was a good intersection of my networking and the Unix side of things. One of the things I love about security and cyber in general is that, you can, the things that we do, the things that you and I do, goes all the way back to George Washington. You think about the Revolutionary War. Yeah. Some of the biggest battles were lost because somebody didn't properly secure their resources, and they didn't have Securis at the time to shred their war plans. But you can have that solid foundation, and yet it's always changing. I was at a meeting with Securis just yesterday, talking about innovations in AI and how we can be doing the next steps. We were talking, about how do we better secure AI and our asset resources that are based on artificial intelligence. So it's always changing, and yet you've got that solid foundation. So it's always exciting. It's not always exciting, but it's never boring. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're seeing AI drive a faster refresh cycle around hardware assets. Most agencies and a lot of healthcare organizations that I work with are scrambling to get rid of devices that aren't going to support Windows 11 and the AI resources. So that's, AI is a big thing in all aspects. It's a big thing for businesses, for improving citizen services and government, but also causes some challenges around IT asset management. So when I made the intro to you, Greg, I talked about this organization called NIST, and not everybody knows what NIST does, but we're not going to maybe share everything that they do, because what they do is pretty broad. But yeah, focus a little bit on, maybe you can tell, generally what they do, but really how does NIST help improve cybersecurity? And I understand it's not just for government agencies, but even banks and hospitals look at NIST and say, hey, what is the best practice for securing my organization?
Oh yeah, it's a wonderful organization, and I'm fortunate. I'm a contractor there, so I can't, I'm not a government employee, but I can speak about them since I've been working with them going on 15 years, which is a great place for me to be. NIST was actually born in 1901 as the National Bureau of Standards. It was their job to help kind of make sure that, when you buy a pound of something, that it actually was a pound. And same thing for lengths and measures and all kinds of things. But the great example of where they are today, you can go back to 1904. There is a large fire just not far from where you and I are sitting up in Baltimore. There was a huge fire in downtown, and they had fire companies came from all over the East Coast to help put out the fire, but they found out that the hoses didn't couple, the hydrants, didn't work together. They had all the equipment, but it didn't work together. And it ended up, I think, something like 1,000 buildings burned down because they couldn't respond quickly enough. So that kind of opened their eyes to the notion that in addition to making sure that we have consistent weights and measures, we absolutely had to better support interconnectivity. The stuff's got to work together. And that's where NIST really shines. Today, they're the National Institute of Standards and Technology, as you said, and much of their work has to do with making sure stuff works together. They're not going to tell us what to do with each second of our day, but you know that you can tune your clock to the National Bureau of Standards and the NIST clock, and you know what time it is. It's the same way for information security. The conversation we're having now is encrypted through encryption methodologies that NIST has reviewed and approved, and that way we know that our tools can talk together. It's the same thing with networking, and of course that's true with other elements of security. They don't tell us what the security plan should do, but they'll give us a catalog of security and privacy controls so that we can agree together on how we're going to interoperate from a security standpoint, and that's really what we do. The main part of what I love working on is on the frameworks, as you said earlier. And the one that I'm mostly focused on is called the cybersecurity framework, which basically is just based on 5 simple functions. If you can identify what matters, then you can do what we need to do to protect it from the known knowns. Hopefully, very quickly, detect what we need to detect in our monitoring role, and then respond and recover quickly. So we released that framework in 2014. And in 2024, we just updated that to version 2.0. We added a whole govern function to kind of go around that, because we found that we can do all the protection and detection we want to, but we need a governance aspect of it to really drive our strategy, to understand what do our stakeholders expect from a risk management perspective. How do we instantiate that through policies and oversight? And we also added a great deal of information there about supply chain. Your listeners, I'm sure, are focusing heavily on supply chain risk management, especially for information and operational technology. We depend more than ever on external apps. The conversation we're having is using something as a service. Everywhere we're depending on these external apps and partners. So we need to do even more than ever to manage the risk to and from those partners to make sure we're doing the right things the right way. And again, that's back to that interoperability. So, from your work, Kurt, in the things that you're doing, there's some of the data that all you have to do is just format the drive and go on about your day. And there's other data that's stored, like healthcare or other sensitive data, where you want somebody to erase that drive and then smash it into pieces and then toss those pieces into the volcano in Mordor. There's some information that's just absolutely got to be well protected. And part of our job in risk management is to understand, which are the crown jewels and how do we make sure the right things are well protected. So that kind of goes back to what we do at NIST, where we can't tell you what to do. Much of what we would want to build into our plan kind of depends on different context and different factors. But we do provide a ton of frameworks and guidelines to help, like the AI we were talking about. Our recent work in the AI risk management framework combined with the cyber framework, that type of thing, that really helps us to work together with our colleagues to see, how do we categorize it? What should we be doing next? How should that work? One last piece I really love about the work at NIST is the workforce framework. So many of the controls, and you go through the international standards, and they'd say that, somebody should do these following activities, but they didn't really focus on the who. And that meant it's difficult to teach people, to hire people, to promote people, to understand where we may have some skills gaps. We weren't so focused on workforce. And I know as a parent, if I say, hey, somebody should lock the door. Well, who's going to lock the door? Well, nobody, if it's not actually assigned to a particular role. So We've been working now for, I guess, going on 10 years about how do we better describe the workforce, the work roles and the tasks and the skills and the knowledge that the people have. And that's turned out to be really helpful for helping people understand, what they should learn, how they should apply it, and what tasks need to be done. So it's been really exciting.
Yeah, Greg, that's helpful. In my house, my wife says somebody should do the dishes, and I think she's just decided that somebody should be me. So that's very helpful in making sure the right people take care of.
Amen. So that role's been defined and assigned, and it's overseen, I'm sure.
Awesome. So we learned a little bit about NIST, which is great. I knew about the Baltimore fire, but I didn't know the history behind why it was so bad. So that was super helpful. So let's talk a little bit more about a federal agency, the Department of Homeland Security. Parts of Department of Homeland Security have been in the news recently, more around like Border Patrol and ICE. That's been, but other people might not be aware that besides securing our borders and making sure that we're tracking who's in our country, DHS does a lot to secure critical infrastructure. And I also understand that they have a role through the Congress and OMB to report back to Congress on how federal agencies are doing from a cybersecurity posture management perspective. So I understand that this CDM program, or continuous diagnostics mitigation program, helps with some of those things. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. And that takes us right back to asset management. Yeah.
Okay.
As you said, in particular, I support the CISA, which is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which, as you said, is a component of DHS, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. It's, if you think about, so much of our nation depends on critical infrastructure. We saw just what happened in Europe just a few weeks ago, where whole sections of the country went down. Now, in that case, you never know which is a cyber attack and which is just the nature of the flexible power grid. But, so much of our nation is very dependent on that critical infrastructure, our water sector, power, making sure that, like you said, our healthcare and financial systems are sound and reliable. So CISA's job is to help monitor those infrastructure components, including the government side. State, local, and federal government agencies can get help from CISA. And CISA is there to help to provide advisories on new types of risks that are happening. They put out lists of key vulnerabilities that the bad guys are exploiting. And part of our program there that I support is the continuous diagnostics and mitigation program, CDM, which started out as an asset management program.
Oh, really?
As you know from your work in ITAM, first thing you need to know is what's on the network, right? So it started out as an opportunity for federal civilian agencies, at least, to be able to load agents and understand, what are the devices, including IoT, operational technology, other cyber physical systems, what exactly is on the network. And they've built a huge database that they use to do asset management, including, they use with new assets coming in as those move and add and change within the organization. And in fact, we do track the disposition of those resources once they reach their end of life. And then, besides just knowing what's there, we also keep track of what vulnerabilities the vulnerability scanners have found. They've got a threat hunt team that keeps track of what they see, just provides a visibility capability for the federal government so that they can see what's happening. They can inform, the agencies have their dashboard. The ECS cyber team that I support provides agency level dashboards, federal level dashboards, maybe someday even state and local dashboards for those entities. But we provide visibility into that IT asset management so that organizations can see what's on the network, who's on the network, what's happening. That supports continuous monitoring for any threats and vulnerabilities that seem to be emerging. And then it helps them to have a better understanding of that bigger picture. You mentioned one of my loves is enterprise risk management. A lot of organizations focus at the system level, and that's vital. but we also sometimes need to take a step back and see, what does this mean about our whole organization? So, this way we can do both. We can go all the way down to a device. We can look at it as a system, as an agency, and as an entire federal civilian executive branch, for example.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. I think, Greg, you and I have a mutual friend, Greg Crabb, who you may have worked with at CISA and other places. I had Greg on and interviewed him around third-party risk a few months ago and IT asset disposal companies. He talked about what has gone wrong in the past and the results and the fines, but he also talked about some of the best practices, and then his company developed a risk assessment for vendors like Securis in the IT asset disposition space, because it turns out a lot of them could do better when it comes to following best practices. So if anybody wants to check that out, they can.
Yes. In fact, I just saw Greg a few days ago. He and I first worked together. He and I were reminiscing that our first work together was at the Postal Service back in the late 90s. Yeah. So, it's like I said, it's exciting, and in many ways, in some ways it's the same, and in some ways it's always changing. We hadn't even dreamed about what AI could be doing these days. But awesome. That's part of the fun. It's a very small town, and he and his son, I enjoyed the interview that you did with them not long ago.
Yeah, that's great. So, Greg, what's something you're passionate about in terms of improving cybersecurity posture of government, or even critical infrastructure that might be run by local governments, or even power companies or financial institutions? Yeah. What are some of the things, if somebody executive team brings you in and say, "Hey, Greg, we're worried about cybersecurity," and talking to our CISO, the list is long. What are things that you tend to look for early on and you're passionate about trying to help people improve?
Well, one of the things that I've been doing a lot of work on, which is risk measurement, has been really challenging. One of my early mentors was a fellow named Jack Jones, who went on to create a methodology called FAIR, which many of your listeners may have seen. We currently see in many of the places I go, even today, I'll ask to see, do you have a risk chart? Do you have a register of your risks that you use to figure out what scenarios might happen and how likely they are? And for many of them, they still just rank their risk as low, moderate, or high, or red, yellow, green, or they use some sort of measure like that that's very qualitative. And it's really hard to, not only is it hard to sort your risks just for cyber, but it makes it even harder when you're trying to compare cyber risk with market risk and labor risk. And one of my customers is even dealing with Brexit risk. There's so many different risks in the risk universe that an organization has to deal with, and it's not really always helpful when all you have to go on is low, moderate, high at best. So what we've really been pressing is the fact that we can do a better job of quantifying the risk. You can come up with a range. We can say that I know what it costs to go down for a minute or an hour or a day. You can go back and calculate for a particular business system or application. This is what it would cost us if we didn't have access to that. Or better yet, this is what we have to make sure we continue to have access to. This is what must go right. So you can figure out the value of your different resources and assets. And based on that, now we can go back and think about what are the threat sources that might jeopardize those. We can think about the factors. It's not just threat or not threat. It's not binary, but we can say, just like we would with our houses. Well, we've got a fence and that helps. We put up a sign in the front that might deter an adversary. We can think about, what we have of value that's where within that house. So we can start to think about not just we have a threat or we don't have a threat, but what's the likelihood that a threat would occur? What would be the things that we could do to decrease the frequency of access by that threat actor? We can think about the vulnerabilities that they might exploit or the pre-existing conditions. Right now with this thunderstorm, I'm about a block off the Chesapeake Bay. So I'm thinking about the flooding and the warnings that they're giving me about the floods that may occur. We can think about a true range. We can start to think about percentages, and I can say, all right, looks like there's a 43% likelihood based on the past 5 years experience. We can actually calculate the likelihood that a flood would occur in my neighborhood. And based on that, I can think about what IT resources might be jeopardized by that flood. And we can actually start to go from, red, yellow, green to an actual exposure, even a $ exposure cost, to say, all right, if this went down for an hour, it would cost me $1 million. There's a 13% chance it would happen. So now we can start to calculate real dollars, and then you can use that for a trade-off. So really, all I'm getting at is there's so much more data that's already available to us to do a better job of estimating and modeling the actual potential risk exposure that we have and the impact that would happen if a scenario were to take hold. And I think enterprises have an opportunity to kind of go from, it feels like moderate to me, to actually thinking about a range of cost exposure that they have that will help them to do better for planning and executing a cybersecurity program for both their critical resources and an overall enterprise risk.
Yeah, that's great, Greg. So if somebody is listening out there and has heard, okay, great. So yeah, I would like to better quantify my either cyber or my enterprise risk. And I'm thinking about these assets that I have, these IT assets and potential threats or vulnerabilities. And they feel like, hey, I want help. Greg sounds like he knows what he's doing. What are ways people can reach out to you? Would you recommend, do you answer LinkedIn messages from people or your website, or what can I put in the show notes if somebody says, hey, I might benefit from talking to Greg and his company?
Well, we'd love to help. And either one is great. I love meeting new people on LinkedIn. I'm getting new friends every day. Yes, feel free to reach out at the site. It's just www.palydin.com. And we'll put that in the show notes, or reach out through LinkedIn. And of course, love to talk to anybody about ITAM or security or any other topic. I've been around quite a bit, so happy to just share. We were having fun the other day, just kind of remembering some of the old good old days. One of the folks broke out an old RipTech report from a long time ago. We were having fun flipping through that. Just it's a fun industry, and it's a very small town. So happy to make new acquaintances anytime.
Awesome, Greg. Well, hey, thank you again for joining. I know I learned some things, and I think the rest of our listeners will learn some things, and hopefully a bunch of new people will reach out to you and benefit from your help.
Oh, I really appreciate you having me, Kurt, and thanks for having me here.